Hello everyone and welcome to the class of Emerging Trends in Microeconomics Research, Econ 413. This is lecture number 13 and in this lecture we are going to learn about income effect and substitution effect. So before starting with this lecture, let us introduce the two concepts first. The first one is the income effect. So what is income effect? Income effect basically means that how we change our consumption, how we change our demand when the income changes, keeping all other factors constant. So, change in demand of a specific good due to change in income while keeping all other factors constant. And all other factors includes like prices and the taste of the individual and many other factors. So keeping those factors constant, and specifically when we keep the prices constant, and you will see why we are focusing on the price in this situation. The other thing is the substitution effect. So in this case, it is the change in demand of specific good due to change in prices. Now the prices are going to change, but in this situation we are going to keep the other factors constant, keeping all other factors constant, and more specifically the keeping the indifference curve constant. The indifference curve should not change in this situation. So let's see how we can include these two types of effects when there is a change in price. So there is a total effect, and that total effect comprises of both substitution effect and income effect. It has both income effect and substitution effect. So for example, we have two goods, and one good we call Q1 and the other good we call it Q2, and there is a change in the price of either of these goods. What will happen when the price change? Then that thing, if let's say the price increase, that commodity gets a bit expensive, and since it becomes expensive, we may say that our purchasing power does not remain the same. such that actually our income has been affected. Our income is not capable of buying those same commodities. So a change in price will comprise of both this income effect, and along with that, since there is a change in price, one good is now cheaper, the other is more expensive. So we will also change our consumption, keep based on the same indifference curve, based on the same level of utility. We will try to choose or substitute one good for the other goods. So let's see graphically how actually these two effects are combined by a single change in price. So we can we can split up the total effect into its two effects that are called the income effect and substitution effect. But in order to understand this, let us draw the graph. So a typical graph, again we have a typical graph with two axes. On the x-axis we are using good 1, we call that Q1. On y-axis we have Q2. So these are the two goods that we are taking in our example, and then we have a budget constraint, and we know a budget constraint is written as y is equal to P1 Q1 plus P2 Q2. So this is basically our income, and we can allocate this income in for these two products for Q1 and Q2. Now for the graphical analysis, we make a straight line equation from this budget constraint equation. And how we do that, basically we write it in terms of P1 Q1 here, which should equal to uh, y minus P2 Q2, and then Q1 is equal to y over P1 minus P2 over P1 Q2, and the slope of this budget constraint, that is equal to minus P2 over P1. And if we write it in terms of Q2, then our linear equation or straight line equation will look like this: y over P2 minus P1 over P2 into Q1, right? So these are the two equations for the budget constraint. It depends on whichever axis you are taking. So when we have Q1 on the x-axis, this is Q1, and we have taken it on the x-axis, then Q2 will be on the y-axis, and the intercept term will be y or P2 over here, and y or P2, and we can draw the graph. So I have already done that. Here is the budget constraint with this point equal to y over P2, and the slope of this budget constraint is equal to minus P1 over P2, and the slope basically represents the relative prices. The negative sign represents the downward slope. Now these are all the combinations we can choose if we are going to fully utilize our income, but we will choose that depends on the indifference curve, and the indifference curve will decide the bucket of Q1 and Q2, the combination of Q1 and Q2. So let's say our indifference curve, we call this IC1, intersects this budget constraint at E1. This will be our equilibrium, and based on this equilibrium, we will consume equal to Q2 dash and Q1 dash. So this is our initial situation. We are consuming Q1 dash and Q2 dash. Now what will happen if there is a change in the price? What will happen if the price of Q1 the price of Q1 is changed? The price of Q1 has increased. So when the price of Q1 increase, when we increase P1, the overall slope should increase. The slope should be more. But what about the intercept? You can look at it in this equation about look at the equation for Q2. When there is an increase in P1, the overall slope will increase, but the intercept does not change. So here the green line is our new budget constraint. The slope has changed, the slope has rotated, but the intercept remains the same. So it has rotated over the point Y over P2. Now we are not able to consume at our initial point, that is out of our budget, Q1 and Q2, that is out of our budget. So we will choose another point that is within our budget but that maximize our utility. Definitely we will move on to the lower indifference curve and the green indifference curve. This is our lower indifference curve. We call this IC2. This is our new equilibrium, and it is touching at point E2. So now we are consuming at Q2 double dash and Q1 double dash. So we have reduced the consumption for both codes. We have also reduced the consumption for Q1 and we have reduced the consumption for Q2. But you should notice that this is the total effect. The change from Q1 to Q1 double dash, Q1 dash to Q1 double dash, this is the total effect. We haven't split it yet. And similarly, the change from Q2 dash to Q2 double dash, this is again the total effect. What about the income effect and the substitution effect? Now remember that in the substitution effect, what we said was that it is the change in the quantity we consume due to change in the prices. But here there is a change in income as well. There is no change in income directly, but indirectly, since the prices has risen, our purchasing power has declined. So we will not change the purchasing power. In order to understand substitution effect, we will have the same purchasing power, but there will be an only change in the prices. When there is a change in prices, there is a change in slope. So instead of our older P1 and P2 that was here, instead of this slope, now we will have the new slope, the slope of the new budget constraint. This new slope accommodates the relative prices minus P1 or P2 after the change in price. So if we are going to keep income constant, we are going to consume on the same indifference curve. If you go back a slide, if you rewind it to that concept, the substitution effect, it is the change in consumption due to change in relative prices, keeping income constant. So the new relative prices will be on the IC1 indifference curve. So let us graph that. This is actually a parallel line to the new budget constraint. These two should be parallel to each other, and I have shifted it back to the original indifference curve so that there is no change in the actual utility. On on the older indifference curve IC1, the utility remains the same, but now only the slope has changed. So we will have another equilibrium over there, and we call that equilibrium E star. So because of changes in prices, there was a change in slope, and on the same indifference curve, if we were supposed to be on the same indifference curve, we were going to consume more of Q2 but less of Q1. The consumption of Q1 has declined, not that much as in the total effect, but overall it has declined, but we have increased the consumption of Q2. The consumption of Q2 because of the change in price has increased. Why? Because Q2 is now relatively cheaper to Q1, right? Q2 is relatively cheaper than before, whereas Q1 is relatively expensive than before, just because of the change in price. But if you look at these two budget constraints, this is exactly, if we move to the lower budget constraint, this is exactly the income effect of it. This is because of the change in purchasing power. On the uh, on this indifference curve, let's call it Y3. On Y3, we are basically consuming with the same utility, but on Y2, this budget constraint, we are actually consuming after the actual change in price and the lowering of our purchasing power. So the total effects, now here we can see that from Q1 to Q1 star, this is called substitution effect, and from Q1 star to Q1 double dash, this effect is called income effect. So these are the two effects that we can separate from this graph. Here is a quick review of the concept that we have studied. Income effect: the change in quantity demanded when income changes, keeping prices and other factors constant. Whereas substitution effect: the change in quantity demanded when price changes, keeping utility and other factors constant. Let us draw them. Here is our initial budget constraint. Then we have the initial indifference curve, and point A is our first equilibrium. Then when we increase the price of Q1, the budget constraint shifts backward, and our new indifference curve is at point meets the budget constraint at point B, so the new equilibrium is at point B. Now let us split it into the two effects, the income effect and the substitution effect. So first, the substitution effect. In substitution effect, the change in quantity keeping utility constant. So utility is constant on the same indifference curve. on the IC1 utility is constant, so we will keep the price ratio exactly the same, and we will shift some sort of shift of the new budget constraint, which reflects the new prices. The new budget constraint, it reflects the new prices, so exactly a parallel shift to that, and we will reach to our initial indifference curve. So the new equilibrium will be at point C. The substitution effect will be at point C. So initially what we do, we reduce the consumption of Q2, we increase the consumption of Q2 and reduce the consumption of Q1, and this effect is our substitution effect. Then we have an income effect. Income effect is basically when the income changes, and when income changes, we shift the entire budget constraint. So income decreases here, and our budget constraint will also decrease here parallelly uh, to the second budget constraint, and this effect is the income effect. And adding these two, basically uh, there is a decrease in both cases. So adding these two effects, initially minus 3, let's say we have minus 3 over here and minus 3 over here, adding these two will give us minus 6. Now there are certain other possibilities. This effect is not always going in the same direction. Sometime the income effect will be more, sometime the income effect will move entirely into a different direction. For example, when we have an inferior good, and we said that the price of when income increases, an inferior good will be consumed lesser than before. A normal good, for a normal good, uh, if we say we have a normal good, by definition, when income rises, quantity demand will also rise. Both of them will rise. But for an inferior good, what happens when income rise? Quantity demand of the inferior good will decline. So let's see, if we have an inferior good, what will happen in that case. An inferior good is, again, this is the definition, when income rises, the quantity demand will decrease for that. For some people, let's say that vegetable is an inferior good. So when they get richer and richer, when their income level is rising, they will consume less of vegetable and they will consume more of meat. So inferior for them, the inferior good is the vegetable. So let's say here we have an inferior good. We have Q1 and Q2, and again the same budget constraint that is shifted. These are all the previous cases, but there is slight difference in the indifference curve 2. This is indifference curve 1. Indifference curve 2 is now in a bit lower position as compared to indifference curve 1. So in this case, again, we have the same effect, that when the prices for Q1 rise, there is a rotation in the curve of in the budget constraint, and initially we have E1. In this case, we have the new equilibrium E2, and E star. This is our substitution effect, the decline because of the substitution effect. So in this case, if you observe, we have sorry, this should not cross. Let me delete this line. I'll try to make this as straight as possible. So this is E1 consuming Q1 at this point. Then we have the total effect. Sorry, this is Q1 dash. This is the total effect. We will reduce the consumption of Q1 when the price of Q1 rises. But an income effect is not with price, it is related with, sorry, an inferior good is related with income, not with price. So because the price of Q1 rise, we are consuming less of Q1. But the income effect can be cleared from this equilibrium. Because of the substitution effect, we are consuming less of Q1. This is substitution effect, but the income effect is working in the opposite direction. Income effect is moving Q1 back to its original position. So let's say because of the substitution effect we move here, and because of the income effect we move towards the higher value. So in this case, the substitution effect is -3, that is normal, but income effect is +2, and this is usually for inferior goods. Here you see that when the income has declined, consumption of Q1 has increased because of this change. So there is an inverse relationship between income and quantity. And if the prices have declined in this case, we would have moved forward. The new budget constraint would be the black budget constraint, and you would have seen that the income effect would have worked in the reverse. So in that case, it was going to be much more related with this definition of the inferior good. Now there is another good as well that we call that Giffen good. And Giffen goods are not found in real life. Maybe there is a case or two of Giffen good, but it is not a usual case, and it would be difficult to give any example of a Giffen good. But a Giffen good is related to prices instead of the income. But again, income effect is responsible in that case as well. And in the inferior good, the income effect is not that much to offset the overall total effect. An inferior good, income effect does not entirely what we can say, but it does not uh, entirely covers the, sorry, cover would not be a good word, but it does not entirely offsets the total effect. You see that in case of income effect, we still have the overall negative relationship. We still have a decrease in Q1, but when we have a Giffen good, Q1 will rise. The consumption of Q1 will rise because of the increase in prices. So let's see how a Giffen good works. Again, we have the same situation. We have Q1 on the x-axis, and we have Q2 on the y-axis. This is our budget constraint, and it has rotated because of increase in price. And these are our indifference curve, first indifference curve, and this is second indifference curve. But if you notice, because of the increase in price, this is E1, this is E2, and if you see, Q1 is our initial, Q1 dash is our final consumption. So because of the rise in prices, we did not decrease our consumption of Q1, rather than we have increased the consumption of Q1. And if you look at the substitution effect, the substitution effect is working as usual. The substitution effect is working as usual. It is decreasing the amount of Q1, but the income effect here is offsetting the entire substitution effect. This is our income effect, and this is our substitution effect. And the total effect is rather positive. So in this case, we may say that the total effect is -3 plus 5, and we may get plus 2. So what is the effect of increasing price? The effect of increasing price on Q1 is that Q1 is increasing. So the demand curve seems to have been violated here. But the interesting thing here is that the demand curve for a given good is always positive. So let's say if we have a given good and we have price of a given good and quantity, that is we replicate this quantity Q1, the demand curve of a given good will be upward sloping. So this is an interesting case, but it is not usually found in a real practice or in real life. So hopefully you have understood the concept. Today we have learned basically two things. The first one is the income effect and substitution effect, and then the second one, inferior good, normal good, and Giffen good. A uh, quick revision of the types of goods. Normal goods, when price rise or when income rise, quantity demand decreases for that good. An inferior good, when income rises, the quantity demand for that good rises. When income rises, the quantity demand for that good declines. And given good, when price falls, the quantity demand for that certain good will decrease, and when price rise, the quantity demand for that specific good will rise. So hopefully you have understood this lecture. If you have any question, please do ask in the comment section. Thank you very much.